The cabin was calm, passengers settling in, a baby giggling in the background, and the hum of the engines growing steady as the plane prepared for takeoff. But in a matter of seconds, everything changed. A high-profile CEO, seated in first class, suddenly stood up and shouted a word no one expected to hear, *Hijack. The word sliced through the air like a blade, sending shockwaves through the cabin. Passengers froze, panic flickered across faces. Flight attendants rushed to assess the chaos. But this wasn't an emergency, it was something far worse. A false accusation with dangerous undertones. The so-called threat. The pilot, a calm, composed black man who had just greeted passengers over the intercom minutes earlier, he hadn't even left the cockpit, yet somehow, that was enough for the CEO to leap to the worst assumption imaginable. And it wasn't just any CEO, he was well known, powerful, and used to getting his way. But this time, his power trip collided head-on with the truth. The tension in the cabin was electric. Some passengers whispered in confusion, others reached for their phones. Meanwhile, the accused pilot remained silent for a moment that felt like forever. Then, he finally spoke, and what he said didn't just silence the shouting CEO, it left the entire plane in stunned disbelief. You won't believe the way he handled the situation next. What happened after that moment turned a flight into a national headliner, forced everyone on board to rethink everything they thought they knew. Everyone on board held their breath as the black pilot's voice came through the speaker, steady, calm, and firm. No anger, no panic, just quiet strength. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are investigating a misunderstanding and will keep you informed, he said. But inside the cockpit, a storm was brewing. The crew had already radioed the ground. Security teams were being alerted, and the pilot, Captain Jordan Miles, knew he was about to face more than just a flight delay. He was about to defend his name, his professionalism, and his identity. Most people on that plane didn't know was that Captain Miles had over 20 years of flying experience. He was one of the few African-American pilots to rise through the ranks at a major airline. He had flown through dangerous weather, handled emergency landings, and even trained younger pilots. But nothing had prepared him for being publicly accused of something so serious based solely on how he looked. Meanwhile, the CEO, Richard Langston, stood his ground. He claimed he saw something suspicious. He insisted he was acting in the interest of safety, but passengers were beginning to whisper. Some took out their phones, quietly recording. Others looked confused. Nothing strange had happened. So why the sudden outburst? Tension gripped the cabin. Was this really just a misunderstanding? Or was something deeper going on, something that had nothing to do with safety, and everything to do with assumption and fear? The answers were coming, but not yet. As the minutes dragged on, the plane remained grounded on the tarmac, and whispers turned into murmurs of concern. A few passengers began questioning the flight attendants, trying to understand what had really happened. One woman in row 12 leaned toward her seatmate and said, "Did you see anything?" "Because I didn't." Her seatmate shook his head. "Nope." Pilot just gave the usual welcome. That guy's yelling about a hijack. But for what? In the cockpit, Captain Miles was reviewing protocols with his co-pilot, while calmly updating the airline's operations center. His voice was clear, but inside, frustration simmered. He'd worked hard his entire life to earn the respect that came with his uniform, and in a single outburst, someone had tried to strip it all away. But this wasn't about ego, it was about dignity, about how quickly fear could turn into something much uglier. Meanwhile, Richard Langston, the CEO, was still on edge. He pulled out his phone and made a call, his voice low but intense. "Tell PR to prepare a statement. I don't want this turning into something it's not," he said. But even he could sense the shift in the cabin. People weren't siding with him the way he expected. Flight attendant Carla, who had worked with Captain Miles for years, stepped into the aisle. Her eyes scanned the rows, noting the unease. She'd seen bias before, subtle and silent. But this was loud, public, and now recorded by multiple passengers. No one knew what would happen next. But one thing was clear, the truth wasn't staying hidden for long. Outside the aircraft, flashing lights from airport security vehicles lit up the runway as they approached the plane. Inside, passengers gripped their armrests, watching from their windows, unsure if they were caught in the middle of something dangerous or deeply unjust. Captain Miles was instructed to keep the plane stationary while the airline conducted an internal review, standard protocol in such claims. But for him, it felt like being placed on trial without cause. Richard Langston paced near the front of the cabin, occasionally glancing over his shoulder at the cockpit door, as if waiting for someone to emerge and validate his outburst. But no one did. Instead, whispers turned into murmured outrage among the passengers. A young man in economy, live streaming quietly from his phone, whispered, "This is about race." He saw a black pilot and jumped to conclusions. Others nodded silently, unwilling to speak but clearly agreeing. Flight attendant Carla returned from the cockpit and locked eyes with Langston. "You've caused a serious delay, sir," she said firmly. "Captain Miles has flown longer than most people here have even traveled. If you made a mistake, now's the time to say it." But the CEO crossed his arms. "I know what I saw." Then, the cabin door opened, 2 airport officers stepped in, scanning the scene. One quietly asked, "Where's the pilot?" The room tensed. All eyes shifted to the front. Passengers leaned forward. Cell phones pointed toward the aisle. Everyone could feel that something big was about to happen. Captain Miles stepped out of the cockpit, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. The cabin fell completely silent. Even the restless children quieted down. He approached the officers with calm professionalism, giving his name and credentials. One officer nodded respectfully, clearly aware of who he was. But before anything else could be said, a voice rang out from the middle of the plane. "I saw it too," said a man seated in business class, standing slowly. Every head turned toward him. He looked nervous, glancing around as if unsure whether to speak. I thought I saw the pilot leave the cockpit before we took off. I didn't want to say anything earlier, but Captain Miles didn't flinch. "Sir, I never left the cockpit. You must be mistaken." But now, the tension doubled. Was this man truly confused? Or was he backing the CEO to avoid confrontation? Worse, sharing the same bias. Passengers began to murmur again, some visibly irritated. Carla turned toward the second man, her voice firm but steady. "With all due respect, we have logs, camera footage, and protocols." The captain was in position the entire time. Just then, a flight attendant handed something to the officer: tablet footage from the boarding process. One of the officers stepped back, reviewing it quickly. His expression shifted slightly, but he said nothing. Langston's jaw clenched. For the first time, he looked unsure. The second man sat back down, his confidence fading. Something wasn't adding up, and now, the pressure was building fast. The officer reviewing the tablet finally looked up, his voice firm and clear. "The video confirms Captain Miles was in the cockpit the entire time. There was no breach, no unusual movement, no threat." A wave of relief swept through the cabin, but it was quickly replaced by a tense silence as all eyes turned to Richard. Langston, the powerful CEO who had confidently accused a man moments ago, now stood frozen, exposed under the weight of truth. Captain Miles stepped forward, his voice steady but laced with quiet intensity. "You didn't see a threat. You saw me, and that was enough for you to yell hijack, disrupt a flight, and put lives at risk. You need to ask yourself why." Langston opened his mouth, but no words came out. Before he could respond, one of the officers approached him. "Sir, due to your false report and disruption, we'll need you to deboard and answer a few questions." Gasps filled the cabin. Even the second man who had backed Langston earlier now sat frozen, avoiding eye contact as Langston was escorted toward the door. A young girl near the aisle looked up at Captain Miles and whispered, "Are you okay?" He smiled gently and nodded. "I am now." Just when the tension seemed to ease, Carla returned from the cockpit holding a printed passenger list. "Captain, you're not going to believe this." She handed it to him. At the bottom of the list was a name: Jordan Langston, Richard's son. Booked under a different seat, on the same flight. No one saw him board, and just like that, the story wasn't over. Captain Miles stared at the name on the list, his brow furrowing. "Jordan Langston," he repeated. Carla nodded. "He boarded last minute, window seat, row 21. The captain turned slowly, scanning the rows. Toward the back, a young man in a hoodie raised his hand slightly, eyes wide. "That's me," he said quietly. All eyes shifted again. The pieces started falling into place. Richard Langston had spotted his estranged son, whom he hadn't seen in over a year. But instead of reacting like a father, he'd panicked, assuming the worst in a moment clouded by emotion, fear, and a bias he refused to acknowledge. Jordan stood up, his voice calm. "I didn't tell him I was flying. I just wanted to go home quietly." Captain Miles gave him a nod of understanding. "You didn't do anything wrong." Jordan looked